Hello everyone. Today we are going to continue our journey in the short-run economic fluctuations. The previous lecture focused on the business cycles of the output market. So today we will focus on the business cycles of the input market, especially the labor market. We will also talk about the prospect of fiscal policies to stabilize the economy. In the last lecture, we discussed three key indicators of the macroeconomy. They are respectively GDP, unemployment, and inflation. We know that the output measure, GDP, can be decomposed into C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, the government expenditure, plus NX, the net export, on the demand side. So we attempted to explain the short-run business cycles of the economy by the C component and I component in the last lecture. Today we are going to discuss the effect of the third component, the G component, on business cycles. The G component is closely related to fiscal policies of the government, so today we will have some policy implications. Let's look at this familiar big picture for the module again to make sure you understand where you are standing. I showed you this graph in the last lecture as well, and I will show you this map in the beginning of every lecture. We are still talking about the short-run business cycles or economic fluctuations. But the angle today is from the government's point of view. We all hate economic instability. So does the government. Therefore, the government has developed many tools to stabilize the economy. We will focus on the fiscal policy today, but the government has more than just fiscal policy. Now let's look at the map for this lecture. As you can recall, it is adapted from the one from last lecture, given that both lectures are talking about the same issue, short-run business cycles. We are still based on the decomposition of GDP into C, I, G, and net export. And we are going to develop a multiplier model to wrap up all the components in one framework. However, note that this is only a partial story because it is only on the demand side. To complete the story, we need to talk about the supply side as well. Any output is produced by input, and the most important input is, of course, labor or employment. We are going to combine the labor market on the supply side with the multiplier model on the demand side towards the end of the lecture today. This is a complete model of short-run business cycles. There are two tasks today. The first is to describe how the economy works on the demand side and on the supply side. And we will take a gradualism approach. That is, we start with a simple model and then add more complications onto it. The second task is to prescribe how to stabilize the economy. We will discuss whether or not fiscal policies can stabilize the economy and then discuss how to stabilize the economy. The first task is called descriptive analysis, which is the basis for the second task, the prescriptive analysis, because you cannot change the world without understanding the world. Let's begin the descriptive analysis with the historical evidence. The red line here is the government size relative to GDP, and the blue line is the GDP growth rate. As you can see, there is a secular increasing trend of the government size, and at the same time, the GDP growth rate tends to be more stable after the Second World War. It seems as if a bigger government can smooth the economy. However, many economists argue that the two events are not causal but coincidental. In other words, it is not a bigger government size that causes the economy to stabilize. They just happen to occur at the same time. You should not attribute a stable economy to the government, but to something else. Well, after this lecture, we hope we can answer this question, whether the government, especially fiscal policies, contribute to reducing business cycles. Based on our knowledge of decomposition of GDP, we will build a simple multiplier model first to explain the demand side of the economy. Let's only consider the C and I components and ignore the G and net export components for now. The C component is modeled by the consumption equation. It can be split into two parts. The first part is the fixed amount or autonomous consumption, denoted as C0. It is the subsistence level of consumption anyone would need to survive, regardless of your income level. The textbook explains different factors that influence this C0 term, such as house price and target wealth. The second part is the variable amount, which depends on two things. The term C1 is called marginal propensity to consume. It describes the proportion of your income you would like to spend on consumption. People with credit constraint or weak will usually have a higher C1 because you cannot or will not consume less. The term Y is the current income, to which C1 is multiplied. In the long run, Y is determined by the supply side, but in the short run, Y is usually assumed to be determined by the demand side. To summarize, consumption component C is equal to the fixed amount C0 plus the variable amount C1 times Y. Now let's turn to the I component, which describes the demand for output from the firm. Like consumption, investment can be modeled by an investment equation. But instead of explicitly express how it is linked with the underlying factors, we use a generic implicit function of I to express how investment decision is made. It is straightforward to see that investment I depends on three things. The first thing is the interest rate R. A higher R means higher financial cost. So firms would invest less in this case. This is the key determinant for investment. The second is the profit rate P. A higher P means higher demand for investment. The third determinant is the discount rate Rho, which measures the impatience of people. If one is very impatient and can't wait to consume his income, then investment will be very low. Well, here is something I have to point out. In mathematics, when we draw a graph of a function, we usually put this cause variable, or x, or independent variable, as the horizontal axis, and the effect variable, or dependent variable, or y, as the vertical axis. However, in economic models, we sometimes reverse the order. As you can see from the graph at the upper right corner, the vertical axis presents the cause variables or independent variables such as interest rate, profit rate, and the horizontal axis is the effect variable or dependent variable, the investment I. Now that we have explored how C and I are determined in detail, we are ready to combine the two components to explain the demand side of the economy. The aggregate demand for output AD, which is actually the GDP calculated using the demand method, is equal to C plus I. Plug in the expressions of C and I we derived from the previous two slides. We have this AD equation. Note that we only keep the key determinant for investment, the interest rate R, in the investment equation. In the short-run models like what we are doing now, we usually follow a Keynesian tradition to assume that demand determines the supply. So the supply side of the model is basically left unspecified. There is actually a historical reason for this assumption. In the time of Keynes, who is probably the greatest economist in the UK in the 20th century. The economy was suffering from the Great Depression in the 1930s. The main reason is that there is a lack of demand for output, so there was an extremely high unemployment rate and low GDP. Therefore, it is natural and straightforward for them, for Keynes and his followers, to assume demand determines supply in Keynesian models. Therefore, in the short run, the aggregate supply, or AS, has to be equal to aggregate demand. No matter how much you demand for it, that will be how much will be produced. Let's call the AD and AS the same thing because they are equal in the equilibrium. Let's denote it as Y. As you can see, there are two Y terms on the left-hand side once you assume this equilibrium in the short run. One is on the left-hand side and the other is on the right-hand side. Let's rearrange it to factor Y out because we are interested in how output, or GDP, is determined in all macroeconomic models. After very simple algebra, you will be able to solve Y in this form. The red part is called the Keynesian multiplier, or the multiplier, because it is always greater than 1. To see that, recall C1 is the proportion of your income used for consumption, or marginal propensity to consume. So 1 minus C1 is still a fraction, and 1 over a fraction is greater than 1. The black part is called the autonomous demand, including the autonomous consumption C0 and investment. It would be helpful if we have some numbers in. Assume C1 is 0.6, which means you would consume 60% of your income. Then the multiplier is equal to 1 over 1 minus 0.6 equals to 2.5. The intuition behind means every pound you spend can create 2.5 pounds of GDP. Why is that? Why there is such a multiply effect? The short answer is that your expenditure will become another person's income. So he will spend a proportion of the new income, and then this new income will become another person's income, and so on and so forth. Due to the fractional consumption, the additional GDP created in each round will decline to 0 over time. And if you have ever learned geometric series, you will notice that this multiplier is actually the sum of the geometric series. We have just derived a solution to GDP using maths. It would be helpful to use graph to show the solution in an equivalent way. In a diagram with AD on the vertical axis and AS on the horizontal axis, the consumption equation C equals to C0 plus C1 multiplied by Y is a typical linear function, with C0 the intercept and C1 the slope. It is upward sloping because Ci is greater than 0, and it is flatter than the 45-degree line because C1 is less than 1. But if you have any difficulty in understanding this corresponding diagram of a linear function, you can take a look at the short course in quants available at the module website. The aggregate demand curve, the AD curve, is simply C plus I. If we treat I as a constant, it simply shifts the C equation up by I units. In the short-run equilibrium, aggregate demand equals to aggregate supply, or AD equals AS. So any equilibrium should lie on the 45-degree line in this diagram. Once you combine the AD curve with the equilibrium curve, which is the 45-degree line, you can easily solve the equilibrium GDP at the intersection point. And this intersection point can be decomposed into the C component and I component. Now let's use a numerical example to show you the multiplier effect. Assume the original economy is at the point A. Suddenly, due to some unfortunate shock, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, investors are very pessimistic and reduce their investment by £1.5 billion. That corresponds a drop from point A to point B. However, this is not the end of the story, because a drop in investment means a drop of income for other people. This effect will pass on to a wider economy, but at a decreasing step, until the new equilibrium point Z is achieved. As you can see, the total effect on GDP is much larger than the initial drop in investment. Let's say the total drop in GDP is £3.75 billion. Then the multiplier effect is equal to 3.75 divided by 1.5 equals to 2.5. We have just introduced the simple multiplier model where we only have C and I in AD. We have two ways to extend the model. The first one is to include the G, the government expenditure, into the model. G stands for the public goods and services provided by the government, and it also includes the public investment, such as infrastructure, the road, the water plant, or whatever. But if you introduce G into the model, you implicitly assume that there will be taxes collected by the government, because if you don't have tax income, the government will not have money to spend in G. So the effect on the consumption equation is that you will have to deduct the income tax from the income Y. So the net or after tax income will become 1 minus T multiplied by Y. But previously we don't have this red part, 1 minus T. Apart from these two effects, there will be government debts as well. Well, if G is greater than TY, T is the tax rate, then that means the expenditure is greater than the tax revenue in this year. Then that means you will have a deficit, and you will have the government will have to borrow money from the public to finance its expenditure. On the contrary, if G is less than TY, then the government is running a surplus. The story about the government debt is introduced in 14.8, if you're interested in. The second way of extending the model is to include NX, or net export. Net export is equal to X, the export, minus M. M is the import. X, you can treat it as the demand from the foreigners to your country's product. So basically it's just consumption in another way. You basically model X in the same way as modeling C, but X is just the consumption from the foreigners. Export or foreigners' consumption depends on the world's income, just like C depends on your national income. Again, we treat it as exogenous because basically one country is too small for every other countries. So let's assume the foreign demands in the rest of the world is exogenous to you. You can't affect the rest of the world, but the rest of the world will determine you. Now, import is basically the consumption of the nationals to the foreign products. Now, just like in modeling C, the consumption, we can assume there is a proportion of consumption of your income. Let's assume this is equal to M. M is the marginal propensity to import, or the marginal propensity to consume respect to the foreign goods. So this M must be lower than our C1, because C1 is a proportion of your income you will spend on your domestic goods, but M is a proportion to spend on foreign goods. If you are a patriot like Donald Trump, you would like to keep M low or even equal to 0. C1 is usually higher than M. And there's another difference. If you notice, there's no intercept here. The intercept C0 in the consumption equation stands for the autonomous consumption, even though you don't earn any money, right? But in the case of import, if you don't have any money, you don't have any income, then you basically don't consume any imported goods. That is very straightforward, right? Because if you are broke, then probably you will get some money from your government, but you will be forced to buy your domestic goods because the domestic goods are usually cheaper than imported goods. Right, so that is the net export component. You basically model X as the exogenous variable and M as a proportion of your income. Then we can put everything together. AD, the aggregate demand, is equal to C0 plus C1, 1 minus T multiplied by Y. This first two terms are actually our consumption after taking into account of tax. And then C plus I plus G plus net export. Net export is equal to X minus MY. Now we can see that there are two Y's on the right-hand side. And then we combine this demand side story with the equilibrium condition. The equilibrium condition is the same as the simple version of multiplier model, that is AS is determined by the AD, which is basically equal to Y. Okay, Y is the GDP demanded for or produced. Now we can combine the supply side and the demand side together. Then you will, after some algebra, well, I won't go through the details, but I think it is quite straightforward. It's a little bit tedious when you try to factor out Y, but I believe in you. I think you can definitely do it. These symbols looks quite scary, but they are nothing if you know how it works. Just try to solve the equation by factoring out Y and then divide through all those coefficients, and you will get this. And as you can see, the simpler model, the multiplier of the simpler model is 1 over 1 minus C1. The new comprehensive model here, the complete model here, the multiplier is much smaller because 1 minus T will reduce C1. Once you reduce C1, minus C1 will be increased, and 1 minus C1 will be increased. So 1 over 1 minus C1 will be smaller. Yeah, did you get it? I can repeat it again. C1 is multiplied by 1 minus T. 1 minus T is less than 1, right? So C1 becomes smaller. Minus C1 becomes bigger. So 1 over a bigger thing means the multiplier is smaller. Okay. If you have some difficulty in understanding this, you can again go to the website to find the short course in quants to review your mathematical knowledge to understand this. Like any economic models, you should have supply side and demand side to have a complete story of the market. It's the same for the macroeconomy. We have a GDP, but we only describe the demand side of how demand for GDP is determined by C plus I plus G plus net export. But there's no story about the supply side at all. So to fill this gap, we try to use a production function to describe the supply side of the model. The supply side, or the AS, aggregate supply, can be modeled as produced by the input. The input here is the labor input N. Okay, this F is a function of N. That means it will be an output corresponding to a level of input. Now let's make it simple. It is just a linear function. Okay, so if you have an input of N and the output is equal to lambda multiplied by N. This lambda could be equal to 1, could be greater than 1 or less than 1. It depends on your productivity of labor. So basically this lambda is the productivity of labor. Right, so if you have 2 people producing something and lambda is equal to 1, the output is equal to 2. Okay, so this is how you produce output using your input. This is a supply side story, very simple. We could have a more complicated story, but let's keep it simple because you're not required to know all this complete technicality. So now the supply side is described. We also had the complete story of the demand side, which is equal to C plus I plus G plus net export. And we also have the third condition, that in equilibrium, supply should be equal to demand. Now we have three equations, and we will combine three of them so that we can solve for y. Okay, because what we are interested in this model is GDP. If you still remember, the key, the central variable of any macroeconomic model is GDP. Okay, so we basically solve GDP based on all the other parameters and tax rate and government expenditure, these policy variables. Now we will have to review the labor market model in the unit 9 you have learned in the previous semester. Or if you didn't, then you probably want to go through this quickly. Right. In the labor market model, the labor market is an input market model. What we have been doing here, the three equations are describing the output market. So this is these three equations are a model of the output market. Now we need to discuss the input market a little bit to explain how n is determined. Because in this output model, we can explain y, but we can't explain n. We use n to explain y. To explain n, you need to know the labor market or input market model. Okay. In the labor market, we have two curves, which actually describes the firm side and the worker side. The firm is the demand side of the labor market, right? The firms hire people, they demand for labor. The workers are actually supply side of the labor market because they supply labor to the labor market. There are two curves you have learned from Unit 9. The price setting curve describes when firms are happy. Okay, this is a curve collecting all the optimal choices of the firm when they maximize their profit. On the other hand, the workers have to be happy as well. When they maximize their utility, workers are actually consumers, right? They just have different roles in the input market and output market. When they are in the labor market, workers have to maximize their utility. And when they optimize, there will be a line or curve collecting all the optimal choices. And that choice is called wage setting curve. So on the firm side, you will have a collection of optimum that is called price setting curve. And on the worker side, you also have a collection of optimum, and that is called wage setting curve. Only when both are happy, both firms and workers are happy, then the labor market is in equilibrium. And when the labor market is in equilibrium, you will be able to set the W, the equilibrium W wage, and equilibrium N. Once N is determined in the labor market, you will be able to put that into your supply side of the economy and then determine your Y. Once Y is determined, you can explain the whole output market. Right. So if you only explain the input market or only explain the output market, that is called partial equilibrium because you only explain the equilibrium in one particular market. But if you explain the equilibrium of all markets at the same time, then it is called general equilibrium analysis. So now let's combine the supply side and demand side to see the comprehensive model with both labor market or input market and the output market. Right, so let's start with the input market. As we said, in the labor market, if you are in equilibrium, you need to make both firms and the workers happy at the same time. The price setting curve is describing when the firms are optimized. So every point on this horizontal line is an optimal choice for the firm. If you want to know why this is horizontal, you can go back to the textbook unit 9 to understand that. And at the same time, the workers has to optimize, and that is summarized by the wage setting curve. Now, I can briefly explain that to you because it is simpler. When wage increases, that means you will have higher income. So if you are the worker, you would like to work more, right? Because you are earning more. So that is why there is a upward sloping wage setting curve, because people want to work more when wage increases. And only when the workers and the firms are happy at the same time, then you will be in the equilibrium. Let's say the original equilibrium is at point A, and that happens in the input market. So the equilibrium wage is at this level, and the equilibrium N is at this level. Now, at the same time, because we are talking about the general equilibrium, the output market has to be in equilibrium too. In the output market, we have an AD curve, and we have a 45-degree line here. And in equilibrium, these two lines have to intercept. And again, this is the corresponding equilibrium point A, and this is your output in equilibrium. Okay. Now let's look at an unfortunate case, like in the COVID-19 or in the Great Depression or Great Depression in the 1930s. Then the AD drops due to pessimistic expectation or due to some unfortunate shocks in the economy. AD decreases. If the output market has decreased, then the new equilibrium will go to C after this multiplier process. Okay, this is what we call a recession, because we are in the low point of the business cycle. And at the same time, the labor market on the supply side will have effect, because you no longer need so many people. So N prime will correspond to a new point in this wage setting curve and price setting curve. The workers would like to get paid less. You see, that is what they would like to be paid if you only can work a less hour. But the firm has to pay them W in reality, because there is a rigidity in wage. You can't really reduce wage even in the recession. So what you do is to lay off people. At this wage, you will only need less people than actually wanted in the market. So that is the recession. In the recession, unemployment will kick in. And reversely, if there is a boom, like in the 1990s, when there is a bubble in the internet market, we call it .com bubble, then a lot of investors squash into the investment. And there is an optimistic investment atmosphere. So AD shifts up out of some irrational exuberance. And in that case, you will have a new equilibrium B. And this B is achieved by the same multiplier process. And at this time, you will have a new equilibrium point in the labor market too. Actually, you would like to have a higher wage if you have to work this much as a worker. You would like to have this high wage, but you can't, because the wage probably is fixed at some level in the short run. So in this case, more people would like to work than it is actually hired. Okay, so we have now applied this supply side and demand side of the complete model to explain the business cycle when it is in recession and when it is in boom. As you can see, what happened in output market will be transmitted into the input market. It will cause overheated economy in the output market and unemployment in the labor market in different cases. Up to now, what we have been doing is to set up a model to explain the economy, why there are recessions and why there are booms around the long-run trend. However, no one likes uncertainty. You don't want to be in the cold weather and then hot weather and then cold weather, these extreme cases. So we want to smooth the economy. We want to know, can we or can the government do something to stabilize the economy? According to the model we have just derived, we know that Y, the GDP, depends on a lot of things. In particular, a drop in C0, in I, and in net export can cause recessions. But at the same time, if G increases, it can pull the economy out of it. So at least in the short run, the Keynesian models we have developed can do something to make our economy less volatile. The fiscal policies is capable of make the economy to cool down when it is overheated and heat it up when it is in recession. Nevertheless, there are three main ways to have a dampened effect due to the following reasons. The first one is the size of government, G, is most of it is acyclical, because the spending on health and education are not changeable that easily. They are basically written into the law that the government has to pay for healthcare and has to pay for the education, at least in the UK. You can't change that part as much as you want. They are acyclical. That means no matter what, you will have to spend these. The second point is the unemployment benefits is basically a redistribution. The tax, there are three tools of fiscal policies. The first one is G, we just mentioned that, and the second component is T, the taxation. But taxation doesn't change anything. It just reallocates the rich onto the poor's income. So it's a redistribution rather than creating some new demand. It just reallocates. Right. The only part that is usable, that is feasible to stabilize the economy is the automatic stabilizers. This is the component of the fiscal policies that you can change the economy when you are in recessions and in booms. For example, when you're in recession, then the government will decrease their tax and increase their demand and increase the government bond. B stands for bond. In this case, just like what our Prime Minister is doing, we try to bring back the optimism from the consumers. Now I reduce the tax and I spend more, then more people will have higher income so that the economy will go back to normal. So that is the stimulus during the recessions. But during the boom, when the economy is overheated, too many people are spending and speculating. That is not good for the economy in the long run. So in this case, just like when you have a fever, we try to cool you down, use some ice and other things. In this case, you will have to increase the tax and decrease the government expenditure and decrease the government bond or debt. And this is what we call austerity, especially when you are in some very bad situation. You will have to make yourself spend less. But in the overheated economy, you will also use the same austerity kind of tools to cool the economy down. So we can, but should we? There are actually two different questions. Just like I can kill somebody, it doesn't mean I should, right? So in practice, we know that it is very cumbersome to have the counter-cyclical fiscal policies to be approved by a parliament. You have to go through a long and tedious legal process to get this budget, extra budget approved. So stabilization intervention is usually handled through low-cost monetary policies rather than fiscal policies. Moreover, fiscal policies sometimes even amplify fluctuations rather than reducing them. Government deficit B, as we have seen in the previous slides, it can force the government to adopt austerity, just like the case in Greece. So in conclusion, yes, we can and we should sometimes, but most of the time you should be very, very careful when you use fiscal policies, because it can be very costly, and sometimes it is even making things worse. The first idea is the Keynesians, so that they are very confident about fiscal policies. They think they should and they can. But classical people like Lucas and Friedman, they think that you should not, or at least you should be very careful when you implement fiscal policies to stabilize the economy. So at the end of the day, whether or not we should use fiscal policy to stabilize the economy actually depends on the effectiveness of fiscal policy. It's quite straightforward. If it is effective, then you should use it. Otherwise, you shouldn't. So the effectiveness of fiscal policies can be measured by the fiscal multiplier. And this fiscal multiplier is the Keynesian multiplier we just introduced in the multiplier model. That is the red part here. This 1 over 1 minus C1 multiplied by 1 minus T plus M. So if this multiplier is big enough, then we should use the fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. Otherwise, we shouldn't. It boils down to a empirical question. But our model is a very, very simple one. We just try to shed the light to make you understand how the economy works roughly. A more serious model used by policymakers, by the Bank of England, for example, by the Treasury, is much more complicated. There are hundreds of equations out there for you to solve. Even thinking about it makes me headache. But anyway, that is what a PhD for. Okay, we are trained to solve hundreds of equations to give you a numerical answer whether or not you should and how much you should use the fiscal policies. Well, this question is answered by many people in the literature, like this very complicated named two people. I don't even know how to pronounce their names. They think that this multiplier is different in recessions and in boom. If it is in boom, then it is even less than 1. But if it is in recession, then it is highly effective. It is 1.5 to 2. Another literature initiated by Acontia and his friends use the mafia data to estimate the multiplier. This is a very interesting and clever study. They use mafia's data. I don't know how they make it, but it is 1.5, basically the same as the previous literature. And another literature by Sylvan and Wilson in 2015, they use the miles of highway to estimate it. So basically the economists are trying to use every possible way to estimate this multiplier. If it is greater than 1, then you should use it because it's effective. Otherwise, you shouldn't. There is a famous debate between Barrow and Krugman. These two people are very, very famous in macroeconomics. And Barrow thinks that the multiplier is less than 1, so you shouldn't use fiscal policies. And Paul Krugman thinks it is greater than 1, so you should use it. So up until today, no one has a definite answer whether or not it is greater than 1, or whether or not we should use fiscal policy in stabilizing the economy. That is what economists do. We provide more than one answers. To summarize, we basically have done two jobs today. The first job is to describe the economy. It is called descriptive analysis because we try to explain why there are recessions and why there are booms in the output market and in the labor market or input market. And we developed a so-called multiplier model. We start with a very simple one and then introduce the complete one and then combine it with the supply side. The second job is to do a normative analysis or prescriptive analysis. We try to answer the question, can we and should we stabilize the economy using the fiscal policies? And the answer actually is an empirical one because it depends on how important and how effective is the fiscal multiplier. If it's greater than 1, we should use it because it's effective. Otherwise, it's just like medication, right? If it is less effective and the side effect is greater than its effectiveness, then we shouldn't use it. But a lot of economists come up with a lot of answers, and this is just to confuse you. Just kidding. But this discussion still continues today. So you should know that it may differ in different times and in different countries. So empirical work is very important to answer this question. Okay, have fun.